Inez de la Cruz. Okay. Right. So the question that I really wanted to think more about is this question: does one need a teacher in order to learn anything? And that came from, well, something that I say to my students all the time. That is, you are the only ones that can do the learning for yourselves. Doesn't matter what I do, you are the ones who are in charge. And honestly, every time I say that, I kind of expect them to say, well, then why are you even here? But they don't, because they're polite. And especially after the pandemic teaching, I was also kind of expecting them to say at some point, can we just sit in our dorms and teach ourselves? And I have to say that experimenting with both online and hybrid teaching, at times I had the feeling I was more of a curator maybe than a teacher. I was selecting and arranging materials and hoping that the students would use them to learn something maybe, but I wasn't really sure what the whole business of teaching and learning was. So the pandemic really kind of prompted me to think more seriously about this very radical question, if you want, that is, you know, what do you need to have in order to learn something? So, because I like to think through questions by using ancient sources, I was kind of reminded of this very accomplished and brilliant thinker who herself didn't have any teachers. And that's Sor Juana Inez de la Cruz, who is probably the most brilliant thinker of the early Americas. She was born in New Spain in 1648. She's a poet, thinker, playwright, considered a genius, right? She was growing up exposed to a variety of music, art, magic, and liturgy in that rich environment that was, you know, the early Americas and New Spain. But she never really received formal schooling. She begged for it, but her mom thought it was inappropriate. So she pretty much used her grandfather's library to teach herself, and then was brought to the court, and finally at age 19 decided to enter a convent because she was repelled by the idea of marriage. So she was 19. Now this brilliant scholar, here's a portrait of Sor Juana, has many beautiful works, and with the students last fall I read La Respuesta, which is a letter that she writes. Oh, that's not really formatted too well, okay. Well, that's a letter that she writes to kind of advocate for her own right to study and to publish theology. So this letter is very interesting because in that letter she describes her self-education. So this is a work that is in the genre of the woman's answer. That's kind of, you know, probably started by Cristina de Pisa, the book of the City of Ladies. Probably the most important, famous work there is a vindication of the rights of women. And Sor Juana is kind of like in between these two. So she describes wanting to learn as a child, not being allowed to formally learn, finding a way around it by, when she was 3, shadowing her older sister into reading, the Amigas, that was a school for girls where they were instructed on how to read. So she would hide behind the sister. The teacher saw her but pretended to not see her. And she learned how to read when she was 3. And from then on, she pretty much taught herself. So there are some fun anecdotes that she tells at that point that show you how she was really a child just trying to make sense of this thing of studying. So for instance, she had heard somewhere that cheese makes you stupid. And so she tried to not eat cheese for many, many years because she wanted to be smart. Or she would make like weird negotiations with herself where she'd decide how long it would take her to master a discipline, say, you know, learn Latin would be like 4 months. And then she'd say, my hair is going to grow of I don't know, 6 centimeters in 4 months. So she'd cut her hair until when it grows, and then she'll check, have I learned Latin? If she hadn't learned Latin, she'd cut it back again, and so on. So it's kind of neat to read that letter to see what she's doing to kind of, help herself learn. There are some very poignant expressions that she uses in La Respuesta to describe her situation as an autodidact. So she writes, for my only school teacher was a mute book, my only school fellow, and I'm feeling inkwell. What a hardship it is to learn from those lifeless letters, deprived of the sound of a teacher's voice and explanation. Yet I suffered all those trials most gladly for the love of learning. She laments not only the lack of a teacher, but of school fellows as well. She writes, the great trial I have undergone in lacking not only a teacher, but school fellows with whom to review and practice what had been studied. Her plea for the permission to continue study and publish through this letter does not go well. A year after writing La Respuesta, Sor Juana sold her library, her musical and scientific instruments, donated proceeds to charity. She stopped writing, and then 2 years later, she renewed her vows, signed a statement of self-condemnation, and died the following year. She was 47 when she died. So, how did being self-taught work out for Sor Juana? In the absence of teachers, Sor Juana engaged in self-elencos and self-psychagogia. Psychagogia, leading of the soul, is conducting the soul, turning around the soul in the tradition of Plato's allegory of the cave, his idea of turning around, that we could probably understand like finding your own mind, that's kind of the main purpose of self-education. And self-elencos is the Socratic methodology of questioning. So Sor Juana was enacting this dialogical method of questioning her own beliefs and claims that we could translate as working out the grounds of one's outlook. So not only finding yourself, but also trying to understand what you really think. So Sor Juana created an internal teacher to herself so that she could find her mind and instruct others through writing. And on top of that, she also defended the rights of girls and women to study, write, and publish, and advocated for the creation of female teachers to instruct girls. Her need and demand for teachers, the fact that she was not allowed in school, is an expression of the misogyny of the church and of the society at the time. She yearned for mentors, for schools, and expressed her needs from the vantage point of a person who did tremendously well educating herself. So Sor Juana is self-taught, yet she makes a most compelling argument for why we need teachers. Let me pause a second, I'm having problem breathing. All right. So the next thinker that I decided to look at is Augustine of Hippo. And I decided to look at him because in some ways he serves the exact opposite function as Sor Juana. So he was not self-taught. He had a lot of teachers, some good, some bad, was himself a professor. And he created this theory of the impossibility of teaching from without and the need of the interior teacher. So that's kind of why I bring him in the conversation. Also, Augustine is one of my favorites, and he is such a mess. So Augustine is a late antique thinker, late Roman antiquity, what would be modern day Algeria, at the point was called Numidia. He was born in 354. He describes his childhood and upbringing in a very detailed and colorful way. If you're interested, you should read Confessions. He enjoyed schooling, enjoyed rhetoric, had a lot of philosophical questions in his life, decided to become a professor of rhetoric, and took up a post in Milan. At the point, Milan was not my hometown yet, but was the seat of the court, right? So he goes up from North Africa to Milan. It's a late antique world, so it was all Latin at the point. Goes up to Milan, and that is where he meets Ambrose, who is a bishop of Milan, a very good speaker, and a lovely person all around. He becomes really intrigued by St. Ambrose to the point that he starts confiding in him and pretty much decides to convert to Catholicism. He had been a pagan until that point, which was quite common in late antiquity. So he converts and decides to go back to North Africa with his son, Adeodatus. He had a partner and a lover, but was not married according to civil law. So with his son, Adeodatus, he goes back to North Africa, where he is acclaimed bishop. That's again a fact of the early Christian church. People became priests and bishops in a different way. And that's for the last 20 years of his life, he lives there. Now his son dies the year after they go back to North Africa. Now that's relevant because the work that I used to build up my argument is called On the Teacher or De Magistro. It's a work that's in the form of a Platonic dialogue. And it's a dialogue between Augustine and his son Adeodatus, who had just died and was 16 at the time. So it is mainly a dialogue on the philosophy of language. Wittgenstein loved this dialogue. I have to say I'm a bit relieved that Jörg isn't here, so he cannot take me to task on that too much, because it's a very, very complicated piece of work. The main claim in this is that Augustine expresses skepticism about the power of language to convey anything other than sounds. So he pretty much says, you know, words are not valuable. Things are more important. Knowledge of things are more important, and knowledge of words is more important than words. So words work for nothing. And language can only really communicate words. The beginning of the dialogue, the first two lines, say something like, when we speak, what does it seem to you that we want to accomplish? So far as it now strikes me, Adeodatus responds, who is the son, either to teach or to learn. Now, what Adeodatus claims is systematically destroyed over the next 70 pages. What Augustine really thinks is that if teaching is the process of transferring knowledge from a person to another through language, and if language is inadequate to the task because words do not teach anything, then no one can teach. So Augustine is pretty much stating the impossibility of teaching. Now, sorry. I'm very puzzled by this work. And so I was trying to understand what function it served in the larger opus of the thinker. And in another book called Retrospecciones, Augustine writes that in this book, he wanted to do three things. He wanted to debate, interrogate, and discover that the only teacher is God. So what he describes this book like doing in this other book is two things. He posits a thesis, that is, that there are no human teachers. Yeah. And he also describes three things that you should do with that thesis. So he describes that you should debate, interrogate, and finally discover this truth. Now, this is interesting for us because maybe it helps understand what's going on in this book. So the context is, it is a dialogue between a father and a teenage son. So if I'm reminded of that, considering all the dialogues I have with teenagers, I am not surprised that it's so confusing at that point, right? Especially when you have a bright teenager, words, the meaning of words becomes, undetermined in some ways. It's up for grabs. It needs to be negotiated. So I'm not sure that Augustine is really being super skeptical about the possibility of learning from another. But I think he is questioning that possibility. And just for a little bit of context, Augustine at that point was very concerned with skepticism in general, because he wanted to build himself up as a dogmatic thinker. So he was sure that there is a truth, and he wanted to kind of support the possibility of that type of thinking. So from my secular perspective, what is most interesting in this work is this idea of how it prepares you to the truth. And so digging out some of the things that they say in this dialogue, Augustine states that the purpose of the dialogue is to prepare the mind. So to provide the type of knowledge that prepares and that awakens. And that was a genre in late antiquity. So he writes, for instance, but to exercise and sharpen our mental powers, not only to endure, but to love the warmth and light of that region where there is a happy life. So it seems that the ultimate purpose is not only building endurance and thinking skills, but kind of nurturing a type of desire for a certain type of life. And to build a cautious habit of mind, or we end up distrusting reason because we haven't examined enough what we gave assent to. I love it, because how often we rush into just accepting as true what we want to believe is true. And he says, well, that ultimately brings to skepticism, because if you don't, you cannot trust reason if you rush to consent, to assent to something. And I think that's pedagogically very important. That's worth slowing down and examining stuff. All right, finally, the theory that's proposed in this dialogue is the theory of illumination. And I'm nearly wrapping up. And so that's so puzzling for me. There are several claims throughout the dialogue. One, for instance, says, one is taught not by words, but by things made manifest when God discloses them. There's another claim that says, even in the case of matters discerned by the mind, anyone who cannot discern them hears in vain the discourse of one who does, save that it is useful to believe such things as long as they are not known. Yet, anyone who can discern them is inwardly a student of truth and outwardly a judge of the speaker, or rather of what he says. So what I understand here is that learning is purely an internal matter, and that there's no teaching from outside that can do it for you. I'm reminded of being a young student and trying to sound persuasive and sound as if I had, for instance, understood Hegel, and explain it to my professor, and my professor believing I had understood Hegel, but I knew I had not. And then at some point, something made sense. And so outwardly, nothing really had changed. But at some point, an internal account of what I had pretended to understand presented itself to me. And maybe if I had been a latent thinker, I would have thought, God is finally shining through, you know, right? And explaining something to me. So now, from a non-religious standpoint, how can I work this theory, right? So what do you do if you don't recognize God as having such a role in your life, you know, not being that light that manifests things to you? Well, I take it to indicate that a pedagogy of questioning is indicated, because as Adeodatus, that's his son, says at the end of the dialogue, words do nothing, but they prompt men to learn. So it's not true that they do nothing, right? They do something. They do not convey meaning, unless that meaning is connected to life. As a scholar notes here, the real problem that develops with respect to our words is our tendency to forget the very life that gives sense to our words. So one could say the problem is the abstraction. It's not really, so that's why words stop meaning things. So then, as a teacher, what am I supposed to do at this point? Well, Augustine says very clearly that a teacher does three things. The teacher points, reminds, and encourages. So the teacher uses language, but more than a matter of informing, it uses language to remind us of our mutual connections and how we are connected to life, because that's the only way that we really can find meaning. So when I go back to my original question, the question that was, do I really need a teacher to learn? We had these two ways of approaching the problem. We have Sor Juana, who laments not having had a teacher and school fellows ever, and was a very accomplished thinker and writer. And then we had Augustine, who had many teachers and claims that there's no such thing as teaching anyone, right? But Sor Juana had an early teacher. She had her teacher when she was 3, when she was going like behind her sister, right? So when I try to formulate my own take on this question, what I think that I believe is that even though one doesn't need a teacher to learn now, one needs to know how to teach herself. And so you need to know how to find that voice that does what teachers do. So you need to learn how to find that voice that points, reminds, and encourages yourself to learn. And you can only know that if you have had at least a teacher at some point. So one needs to have had teachers in order to learn. One can only remember an experience one has had, and without that memory, there is no learning. So Sor Juana had a teacher when she was 3, a very smart woman who decided to pretend she was not seeing her so that she wouldn't cause problems. Now, as I conclude my talk, there are a lot more questions than when I started. I have questions about then how do you let yourself be taught? What does it mean to be teachable? Could we think of education as becoming teachable? What type of dispositions should we cultivate in order to be able to teach ourselves? And finally, that I find actually interesting because I've been reading a bit more about anarchism lately, and there's this idea of mutual help. And I thought, well, probably actually the best way is mutual teaching. I'm reminded of how much I learned from my friends, from my peers, in faculty learning communities, in informal reading groups. And so that seems something to think more about. So I have 1 more minute. I have a bonus content for people who stayed until the end. So one of the assignments I gave last fall was for my students to interview a child. And I had to ask them a bunch of questions. And one question was, what would a world without teachers be like? And all children said they're sure that it would be madness and chaos. And I found that puzzling, and in some ways also a bit fuzzy feeling, because maybe kind of nice. But for the most part, it is interesting how deeply seated is the idea that the teacher keeps the world in order. And I'm not sure that that's exactly what we do, but that's what kids think we do. So that is the end of my presentation. Yeah. Oh, the image here is Augustine teaching to friends in Milan. So that was kind of like, so with this, I'm ending my presentation. Thank you very much for listening.
questions.
Okay.
We would love questions and comments, especially since you prepared us so well. If you're on Zoom, you can just unmute or put it in the chat.
Should I unmute or?
They can unmute.
Okay. Yes.
Thank you for the presentation. I don't have anything really profound to say other than just it seems so striking that taking the model of paracletia of preparation for love, right? That teaching of the preparation of a certain kind of desire. It seems as if Juana had this already. It seems as if, in a sense, even though she desired a teacher, she also understood how that desire in a way was more fundamental than any actual teacher. So
yeah,
in a strange way, I don't know, it's almost as if they're both right. I mean,
yeah,
or it's as if it's a different way maybe of understanding Augustine's invocation of God as a teacher. It's almost as if there's a way that your desires can be taking the correct object and that you can come to learning naturally.
yes,
So maybe some of us need attunement to what the desire for learning is, and we need teachers. But at least Juana demonstrates that it's possible that you can just have that. You can have that attunement.
yes, Yuja. Did you want to respond to that, or do you?
No, I'm just.
Oh, it's another question.
Yeah.
No, I think you're right, Tim. I think desire is the key. And I think desire is also, really tricky, because how do you teach someone to want something? Have you tried to talk yourself into wanting something? I've tried, it doesn't work. And so that dynamic is very mysterious, right? And in some ways you want to think you either have it inside you or you don't. And if you don't, no one's gonna give it to you. But then our experience is that actually we can inspire students to want to learn things they didn't know they wanted. So yeah, it's tricky, I don't know. Yuja.
Yeah, thank you. So I have a comment and a question. Comment about the talk was itself points and reminds and encourages. Because I'm thinking about all these things that were on the slide and you talked about. So I like how it's like that. The question is maybe a question to add to the list of questions you had at the end. So it seems like both scholars you talked about ended up with this idea of teaching or learning being just an internal thing that's where you learn from within, kind of, and that's very vague. Like what counts as within you, what's inside you. So you said for Augustine that maybe the God part, that's right, God is doing the work here, comes out in you. And then you also said for both of them, they had early on they had teachers, or for somewhere along the line they had teachers. So that's still. So I was wondering if you could say a little bit more about just what is the internal or
Yeah, so Augustine is credited with having created in Latin the language of interiority. So it's not completely accurate. Actually, Seneca probably had already created that vocabulary. So Seneca is a Stoic thinker that's probably 2 centuries before, right? But this idea of the interiority, like of the inside you as the seat of something infinite, that's puzzling because it's contradictory. But it is something that for Augustine was kind of the heart of the experience of his life, like finding this infinite thing that's God for him completely inside you. That's why Confessions is such a maddening book to read, because you read it and nothing happens. It's like 300 pages and all is he's going on and on about, like, the major thing he understands maybe the nature of evil, or he understands he has no account of evil. So there's nothing really happening, and partially because it's all his interior life. And this is a man that's exploring interior life at a point where the Latin conceptual apparatus was just being formed about it. So what you think it's vague is probably because it's informed by critiques of the concept of self, of identity, but this is kind of too early for Augustine to really be concerned about. He has just discovered this incredible space where so much can happen without people from outside ever noticing that, and that's his interior. He has weird spatial metaphors that he uses to indicate that. I wouldn't really know how else to give an account of that, except that historically for him, it was a big discovery to do that. So I'm probably not really answering your question, but it's okay.
In the chat, we have
Oh, oh.
from Chris and from Stephen, so they should be the last two.
All right, sorry. And Sarah too. So why don't we just hear the questions?
I can ask afterwards.
Sorry.
Right. I think so. Just quickly, and then let's hear from Sarah. Both Chris, I don't know if you read. Oh yeah, you read. Both Chris and Stephen seem to take that to a logical conclusion, that is, then probably all this talk about assessing learning needs to be radically reconsidered. And I think you're right. Yes, you're completely right, both of you. So thanks for bringing that up. And Sarah, you have guys.
Yeah, I love the last point that you dropped in there about what students or young people see the role of the teacher, and without it, there's chaos. And it makes me think about, like, the learning that's talked about here is like a specific academic or music or language learning. But learning is also watching other people do things so that you know how to do them, right? So when kids learn, like, how to engage different parts of the world, they're watching people, like they're getting this sort of learning model. And so it's interesting for me to think, even when we start to separate those types of learning, like, is learning a language an academic endeavor? Is it a home endeavor? Instruments, these sorts of things, as an example. I don't know that I have a lot of an actual question for this, but it's interesting to think about how we find, or how the students were saying that there is some sort of ordering that comes off of from being able to watch other people, be guided by other people, and it provides a framing or a way to kind of think about the world. And they pick up on this, right? Like,
Right.
but maybe it's because we want to go to the anarchist side. Maybe it's a very authoritarian way that we kind of engage with children all around.
Right. Yeah. So, schools historically serve purposes of socialization more than other purposes. And that's partially teaching a person what her place in the world is. And so in that sense, you are right. Both thinkers were thinking of teachers and schools in a setting where there was not mass schooling. And so schools served different social purposes. But it's still an important part of education. And I think children pick up on that before everything else. Yeah, that's true. So I think our time is up. I wanted to acknowledge that Jerry Miller is also online. So hi, Jerry, good to see you. And some other esteemed colleagues, of course. So I want to thank everybody. And now there's a second talk that's going to be even more fun than the first one.
Great. Oh, no, you're fine. Thank you so much. Now we'll be smart this time and we'll share the screen right away. Great. And so continuing the discussion in a different political complexity manner, Len Robinson is going to share his sabbatical work. He is a professor of political science and the director of our international studies. So thank you very much.
Sure, thank you. So, well, first of all, thanks to Martin and to Chris for sponsoring this program and creating these opportunities for us to get together as faculty and share our research and ideas and get feedback. It's a great program, and I know we all really appreciate it. To start today, if it's okay, I kind of feel more comfortable almost acting like I'm actually teaching, right? Maybe I am here. So I just wanted to throw this question out because this will also help me to sort of understand as I move forward how much detail I need to go into this. Is anybody or everybody here, are you familiar with, have you heard of the massacres at Sabra and Shatila? Okay, so a couple of people. What happened at Sabra and Shatila? Are you aware, or you've heard the?
It's a massacre where the Israeli army invaded camp of refugees
Right.
and killed indiscriminately.
Right. So basically what we're going to be talking about today in terms of the historical event was a massacre that occurred September 16th through September 18th, 1982 at the Sabra and Shatila refugee camps in West Beirut. The Israeli army had entered West Beirut the day before, encircled the camps, sent their Christian militia allies into the camps. In over 36 hours or so, about 3,000 unarmed Palestinian refugees were slaughtered while the Israelis ringed the camp in the high ground, and it was clear they could see what was going on. Even shot flares at night, overnight, to assist the Phalange militia in what they were doing. So my basic sort of what I'm really interested in trying to get at here is this is certainly not the first time that the Israeli army had military, the IDF, had targeted civilians, right? We know, for example, if you've ever heard of the Intifada in the late 1980s, 1987 and 1988 into 1989, right? I mean, that was an instance in which, well, does anybody have any images of the Palestinians and what they were doing during that particular event? Because the Israelis framed it as just one more instance of Palestinian terror, right? And actually what was going on was on a nightly basis, we were going home and turning on our television sets and we're watching 12-year-old Palestinian kids with slingshots, throwing rocks at Israeli tanks. And the Israeli military command and political leadership was nightly saying, well, this is just one more version of Palestinian terror. The Israeli military commander at the time in charge of the operation against the Intifada referred to the Palestinians in the West Bank as cockroaches who needed to be crushed under the boots of the, Israeli military forces. So what we're going to be talking about today is what happened at Sabra and Shatila, but in particular, what's most important to me is how and why the Israeli public responded to this event in the way that they did. And I think they responded in a fundamentally different way from some of these other examples we can look at. I mean, even earlier in the 1982 invasion, throughout the summer of 1982, the invasion started on June 6th. By June 14th, the Israelis were to the outskirts of West Beirut and spent the next 9 weeks or so bombing the hell out of West Beirut and killing tens of thousands of civilians. And it was on the news every night, and Israelis were well aware of it. But as we'll talk about, there was strong public support for the war. And in fact, support for the government that was in power at that point was going up throughout that part of the war. It was only as a result of the massacres, and it may seem obvious, well, of course there's massacres and the Israeli public is going to respond negatively to that, but I don't think the answer as to why that is the case is quite as obvious as it may appear to be at first blush. So that's kind of the crux of what I want to focus on here today, because again, historically, if we look at the data, and I don't think this is really unique to Israel, right? As long as state leaders are able to frame, to use the language of securitization theory, which we'll talk about in a moment, as long as they're able to frame a particular event as being a terror threat, it tends to create large-scale public support. It opens the door to what's called in the securitization theory literature, extraordinary responses to existential threats, that type of thing. So now I wasn't able to find, the Israelis conducted another operation against Hamas in 2021. I wasn't able to find actual numerical public opinion data, but it seems pretty clear there was strong support inside Israel for that operation as well. So again, if we go back to 1982, which we will talk about in a little bit of detail in a couple of minutes, the Israeli government framed that invasion as simply one more military effort to destroy the PLO, to defeat the existential threat, which they argued the PLO, and I would argue Palestinian nationalism was their perception, posed to Israel, to the Jewish state. And for a large portion of that war, again, the Israeli population accepted that framing, that securitization claim by the Israeli government. And we'll look at some numbers a little bit later that will support that argument. Now, the PLO was kicked out in August 1982. The United States, Britain, France, and Italy sent multinational forces in. They oversaw the withdrawal of the PLO, but who was left behind were Palestinian civilians who didn't have any security force there to protect them. So the United States had gotten the Israelis to promise, we're not going to move into West Beirut. We're not going to go anywhere near these refugee camps. And that was a promise that obviously Israel violated as you get into September. But up until that point, again, you have strong support for the war in Israel, but it's going to drop precipitously in late September after the massacres. So the research question is, I think at its core is, the Israeli government had been successful at removing the existential threat that they claimed the PLO presented, right? They were ejected from southern Lebanon. They left. Some of them went to Tunis, some of them went to Cyprus, some of them went to other countries in the Middle East. So the existential threat disappeared. The Israeli government was successful in doing that as they framed it. And yet support for the military operation in Lebanon dropped dramatically by the time you get to the second half of 1982. So what this is going to raise from a theoretical perspective, I guess, or this is what's kind of guiding my theoretical consideration of the issue, is what explains the government's failure to quote unquote securitize, right? So that leads us into a discussion of securitization theory. So securitization theory, which has actually gone through sort of several generational changes. So it's initially very much a linguistic-based theory. It assumed that sort of security and security threats were what leaders could make of them simply by constructing them linguistically and convincing critical audience members that this particular event, this particular issue, this particular entity posed an existential threat. The second generation kind of says, well, yeah, that's part of it, but there also has to be some tangible, objective threat based in historical experience there in order for an audience to embrace the securitizing claim. So there are four key analytical units when we look at securitization theory. The first of them being the securitizing actor. This is the political leader who is perceived as having the knowledge and the position of authority to quote unquote speak security, right? To identify a particular issue, a particular actor as posing an existential threat, the referent object of security. And by the way, as we go through, let me kind of stop here and go back. The securitizing actor in this case would be the top level of the Israeli government, the Prime Minister Menachem Begin, the Defense Minister Ariel Sharon. The referent object of security in this case would be obviously the Israeli nation, the Jewish people inside of Israel. The referent existential threat would be the PLO, as well as the Palestinian people. And then the audience that's really critical in this case is Israeli citizens, right? Do they accept the securitizing claim that's being made by the Israeli government in this particular case? So what we're talking about here is a process. It's kind of a two-stage process. The first is that the securitizing agent frames an actor as posing an existential threat to a cherished value, and that requires an extraordinary action such as war. in order to defeat the existential threat. In this case, again, the existential threat was argued to be the PLO stationed in Lebanon. We've got to defeat the PLO. We have to drive them out of Lebanon. If possible, destroy the PLO, but at the very least, get them out of Lebanon. But the second part of the process is the audience has to accept the securitizing claim. And the literature on securitization theory suggests, and I think it's true, that this is where the theory has really fallen short to this point. I mean, we've really struggled to come up with a criteria through which we can sort of judge in advance, what are the factors and variables that are most likely to predict whether an audience is going to accept or reject a securitizing claim. And so I think if we bring in some of the second generation literature here, that's more sort of sociological and less linguistic, this is where we can start talking about resonance. And does the securitizing claim, the identification of the threat, does it resonate in terms of the experience of the audience, the historical experience of the audience? And, obviously, let's face it, understandably so. In the case of Israeli Jews, if you look at the experience of the Holocaust, right? The Munich Olympics massacre in 1972. These are just a few examples. The massacres at the school in Massacres in the 1970s, right? The latter two of these being carried out by factions within the PLO. So it's understandable why, if the government is able to sort of project the PLO as being a particular existential threat at a particular moment in time, that the Israeli population would be, very prone to accepting that argument, all of the things being equal. That's what happened in the first part of the war, as we'll see. It's, as things move along, that the securitizing claim began to lose its salience for most Israelis. So securitization in Israel's 1982 invasion of Lebanon. Again, the invasion began on June 6th. Now, I can spend a week talking about this because there was a lot going on behind the scenes. In fact, originally, the Israeli government said, oh, we're simply trying to push the PLO 40 kilometers north of the Israeli border. And that's all that this is about. Well, in fact, Begin and Sharon had already agreed between themselves, no, this war is really about trying to destroy the PLO, trying to destroy the sense and ideology of Palestinian nationalism. So they got to the 40-kilometer marker within a day and a half and kept right on going up to Beirut at that point. So the goal of the invasion was really to destroy the PLO and the hopes for a Palestinian state among the Palestinian people. So if we want to go back and use the language here, right, what we're talking about is government leaders or the securitizing agents emphasizing the purported existential threat posed by PLO terrorism and Palestinian nationalism. Now, I think from my perspective, you can look at this from the outside. But let me use another example. As horrific as 9/11 was, does anybody think Al-Qaeda posed an existential threat to the United States? Militarily speaking, absolutely not. Right? And I'm not justifying what happened on 9/11. I'm not justifying the terror attacks we identified in the previous slide that were carried out by PLO factions. But the fact is, the PLO never had the military capability to pose an existential threat to Israel. Dreams and desires are one thing, but if you don't have the capability, you're not going to be able to achieve the objective, right? But the Israeli government, and again, it was fairly easy to do, the Israeli population was malleable on this issue because of their experience with terrorism. And they believed that, in fact, the PLO posed an existential threat to the Jewish state and to the Jewish people. So when the government would frame its interaction with the Palestinians in this way and try to make the case for some kind of military action, including obviously the invasion of Lebanon in 1982, it was something that historically tended to resonate with the large majority of Israelis. And again, there was broad public support for the war. Now, it was even higher than 64% when it first started. It declined slightly as the war went on, as we tend to find in almost any country when the war kind of drags on. But also there was a certain percentage of the Israeli population that said, hey, wait a minute, you told us at first this was about a buffer zone. Now you're going all the way up to Beirut and bombing Beirut for, 2 months. So there was some erosion of support there, but the majority of Israelis continued to support the war. And again, I think it's really important to keep in mind here, they were aware of what was happening in those daily bombing raids by the Israeli Air Force, and the severe loss of civilian life inside Beirut for 2 straight months. It's not like the Israeli population was unaware of that, but they continued to support the war. Thus, to that point, I think what we can say is that the securitization claim and effort by the Israeli government was successful. And this is also something important to keep in mind. We were just talking about this in my Middle East class right before this, that we tend to talk about state interest all the time. You can never forget about political self-interest, regime self-interest, whatever you want to call it. So certainly the prime minister at the time, Menachem Begin, was very happy that he personally in the Likud party saw their popularity going up, their public approval numbers going up as a result of the military operation in Lebanon. Then the massacres come along. Now, again, I could spend a week talking about this and exactly the, almost minute detail of this, but the Israelis again had promised made a promise to the Americans, we will not enter West Beirut. The US had demanded that of the Israelis. They said, okay, we are assisting you, we're overseeing the withdrawal of PLO fighters, right? But in exchange, one of the things you have to promise us is you're not sending your soldiers into West Beirut. And the Israelis agreed to that. Now, because I didn't want this to last too long, I admit I'm leaving out a kind of very important event, which was the assassination of the Lebanese president on the 14th, who was an ally of the Israelis. So that's what the Israelis pointed to as their justification for sending their military into West Beirut, right? So they did that the day after the assassination on the 15th. And then it was the 16th, as we talked about before, right? When the Israeli army encircled the camps, they ordered their Christian militia allies to go into the camps. They were clearly in a geographic position where they could see what was going on. And I'll give you a quote later on where an Israeli mid-level officer went to his commanding officer and said, there's a massacre going on down there. And the response from the commanding officer was, we're aware of it, we're not happy about it, but we're not going to intervene. Just stay out of the way and let it happen. Right. So the claimed intent here was, well, we're going to mop up terrorists, right? Again, there's the magic word. Assad's been claiming since 2011, this is really a war inside Syria about defeating terrorism, right? It's not about saving my regime. So anyway, it becomes clear very clearly that the phalangists that have been sent in there, the phalange military, Christian militia, are murdering civilians and not terrorists. There's one account in which a phalangist soldier comes out of the camp and said, we just killed 250 terrorists. And the Israelis laughed at him and said, are you kidding me? It takes us, 6 months to kill 250 PLO terrorists. You want us to believe you just did that in 3 hours? And then the light bulb kind of went off over the Israeli soldiers' heads that what's really going on is they're down there massacring civilians. So a couple of other quotes here. The an Israeli officer overhears a phalangist officer who asks one of his commanders, what should we do with 50 Palestinians that we just rounded up, civilians? And the answer was, this is the last time you're going to ask me a question like that. You know exactly what to do. Again, while Israeli military commanders were in the area. This is the quote that I gave you before. He admitted that, okay, we know it's going on. It's not to our liking, but he ordered his troops not to intervene. Again, the massacres went on for 36 hours. The numbers here vary, anywhere from 1,000 to 3,000 unarmed refugees who were slaughtered by these militiamen who were aligned with with Israel in 1982. So the Israeli government, perhaps not surprisingly, just as they had securitized the first part of the war, says, okay, well, now we're going to try to securitize this. And again, what they're going to fall back on is everything's about terrorism. So they're going to fall back on the argument that the Palestinians in the camps are in fact terrorists and in fact pose an existential threat. If you read the documents that are available now from Israeli archives, and you read the discussion, not just among Israeli political and military leaders, but the discussions between American officials. Morris Draper was the Reagan administration envoy, meeting with the Israelis during this period of time. And every time Draper would say, what the hell's going on? You know, there's going to be, or it's already started, a massacre. The Israeli pushback was, no, they're Palestinians, they're terrorists. You know, this is not a massacre, this is an anti-terror operation. So, and this, you know, Fisk, I think, really sort of captures the essence of this attitude that one sees in Israel, Robert Fisk, in his book, Pity the Nation, right? In Israel, terrorist, quote unquote, means all Palestinian Arabs. So that helps to explain, obviously, why, you know, the Israelis, much as we can say that, as ridiculous as it is in retrospect, to think why in the world did members of the Bush administration believe that Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, had something to do with 9/11? Yeah, they somehow convinced themselves it was true. I don't think all of them simply knew it was a big lie. And so, you know, it could be that there were some Israeli commanders here who kind of, you know, believe this, but I think this does go back to the assumption that if you're Palestinian, you're terrorist. I mean, the official Israeli government inquiry that was launched after the massacre to try to figure out what the hell had actually happened, over 40 times, they refer to the Palestinians as terrorists. In their own inquiry is designed to find out, you know, what happened in those camps and why it happened. So the two, you know, labels there, Palestinian and terrorist, are just inextricably sort of intertwined for the Israelis. Again, they're going to make the claim that the camps are home to 2,000 terrorists. The Reagan administration, Morris Draper, pushed very hard to get the Israelis to withdraw from West Beirut, to pull the Christian militia out. The response from Ariel Sharon, who was the most hawkish of all the hawks in Israel: do you want the terrorists to stay? If you want the terrorists to stay, maybe it's a good idea. It's almost like he's taunting the Americans there, right? We're not interested in saving any of these people. If you won't let the Lebanese kill them, we will. We're convinced that people in the camps are all terrorists. When it comes to existence and security, existential threat, right? It's our own responsibility. And I think the most chilling comment that I came across in doing my research for this was actually from a phalangist who was involved in the massacre, who, when he was asked by an Israeli afterward, you know, how could you do this? Pregnant women will give birth to terrorists. The children, when they grow up, will be terrorists. So we were justified in slaughtering men, women, children. Horrific. I won't even go into detail about some of the stuff that they did to the bodies, etc. Okay, so how did the Israeli society react to this? Because we know in the first part of the war, right, there was strong support. Despite the knowledge that large numbers of civilians are being killed, there was strong support for the war effort. By late September 82, just 38% of Israelis support the war. 60% of respondents to a poll that was carried out by the BBC said that they felt like, Israelis said they felt like that their government had some responsibility for what had occurred at Sabra and Shatila. And it resulted in the largest protest at that point in Israeli history. 10% of the population of Israel turned out for this protest in the aftermath of the massacres at Sabra and Shatila to express their outrage. So again, the question for me is why, what's going on here? The Israeli population seemed comfortable, at least they were accepting the large-scale loss of civilian life at the hands of their own military throughout most of the war. So why does this change now? What is it about the massacres that triggered a shift in public opinion? Well, the first thing that came to my mind is, well, is this some kind of, now this might be a little bit idealistic, but is there something about democracies, right? And their embrace of human rights and this, universal revulsion over democratic political leaders and military commanders and military personnel being involved in these types of things, right? Well, so right away I said, the My Lai massacre. Let's go back and look at the numbers, the public opinion numbers for that. Because surely if this is the case, then the majority of Americans should have been outraged over My Lai, right? 80% of Americans polled after My Lai said that Lieutenant Calley, the commander who was responsible for the My Lai massacres, should not have been convicted. So what that suggested to me is that there must be something going on here within Israeli political culture identity that maybe is what really explains the fact that you had a majority of Israelis who kind of shifted and moved away from supporting the war. So this is where I think this research by Clark et al. Is really interesting and applicable. So looking at the way that the Holocaust has shaped the worldview of Israelis. And so Clark et al. Identify 4 what they call voices. Kind of the first 2 are first order, second 2 second order. Never be a victim again, never forsake other Jews. First order, sort of all other things being equal, these are the 2 most important voices, according to Clark et al. Second 2 being never be a passive bystander when non-Jews are being threatened, and never become a victimizer yourself. So what I think happened here is, for the first time in the history of Israel, at least to that point, right, you had mainstream Israeli voices who said, wait a minute now, based on those second 2 voices, what happened here was fundamentally immoral and wrong, and we have a responsibility for the fact that it took place. Just a few quotes here. These are all mainstream, and one from an Israeli Air Force general that I think is really shocking. Right? I mean, some of you may have heard of Abba Eban, one of the most widely respected Israeli leaders from the founding of Israel into the 1970s and 80s. And here you have 2 highly respected Israeli voices using the word pogrom to describe what happened in Sabra and Shatila. And get down here to the Air Force general, final solution. And if you read between the lines, it seems pretty clear he's very uncomfortable with having to utter that phrase. But clearly, he believes that that's what was going on, that this was in the mind of Begin and Sharon an opportunity to once and for all destroy the Palestinians, the Palestinian national movement, to forever destroy their hope for a Palestinian state, etc. So I think what was going on here is, with the PLO out of Lebanon, right, this whole notion that somehow the PLO posed an existential threat was sort of receding into the background. So those first 2 voices receded into the background as well. And the second 2 voices are the ones that kind of begin to come to the fore. That we have a responsibility not to ourselves look the other way, or not ourselves, certainly not carry out, pogroms, whatever you want to call what happened inside Sabra and Shatila. So in conclusion, and some of this is I think just sort of repeating what I just said, But I think that the second two voices, what's really critical here is once the PLO is decimated out of Lebanon, the first two voices of sort of Israeli worldview are receding. The second two are emerging as being dominant in the national consciousness. And this led a majority of Israelis to rethink their earlier support for the war. By 1985, less than 30% of Israelis said they supported the war in Lebanon. So obviously a steep drop from some of the numbers we saw in the early stages of the war, and to demand that Israeli political and military leaders be held accountable. Now, for how long? One of the people who was forced to resign was Ariel Sharon, who it turned out had a great future in Israeli politics because he was then elected Prime Minister of Israel. Right. Like you can see posters from British Mandate Palestine with the most wanted terrorists in British Mandate Palestine. Among the top 10 are Menachem Begin and Yitzhak Shamir, both of whom eventually became Israeli prime ministers. Sharon had the same experience, right? So I mean, I do think this is important and it's different, right? Because it was the first time in Israeli history that the Israeli people were looking at a war and saying, we're not just going to criticize the government and our military leaders on the conduct of the war, the sort of strategic conduct and outcome, but also we believe that there was something fundamentally immoral that happened here and the government needs to be held accountable for it. So when I think about moving forward in future research, just a couple things I want to bring up and then I'll be done because I'm probably lost track. Okay, not too bad. All right, so one of the things that occurs to me is, obviously the Holocaust generation is nearly gone, those who directly experienced the Holocaust. So if that's the case, well, these voices of identity, including the voices, those strains that can constrain these types of actions, are they going to just sort of fade off into the political ether and sort of be replaced by what we see happening all around the world right now? This more exclusivist form of identity based on ethno-national identity. And most of the evidence, I would argue, to this point says, yeah, that seems to be happening. I mean, the left in Israel practically doesn't exist anymore. The Labor Party essentially doesn't exist anymore. So the last election, you had an election between a right winger and someone who was not quite that right wing. And it's a multi-party system, but everybody knew it's going to be one or other of these two, candidates. Now, that's kind of depressing to me, I'm to be honest. But then, literally this morning, I read this. I go, I got to put this into the slide at the last minute, right? Because there's an Israeli cabinet minister who's looking at the spike in violence being carried out by Israeli settlers against Palestinian civilians and said, well, listen, this is terrorism. And we need to call it terrorism. So, that might give us some cause for hope. The other thing that I think is important here, because it gets us back to the question of existential threat, right? Israel seems to be sliding towards a one-state solution. And by the way, I don't think it's necessarily some grand long-term strategic plan. They just kept kicking the can down the road because they don't want to deal with it. What do we do with the occupied territories? And now they finally get to the point with, oh my God, we've got hundreds of thousands of settlers. We can't pull them out. I mean, the last time we did that was when we signed a peace treaty with Egypt and all hell broke loose, trying to drag whatever it was, 3,000 settlers out of the Sinai. So I think, and by the way, interestingly enough, the polls among Palestinians show a growing number of Palestinians are embracing a one-state solution rather than two-state where they get their own state. You might think that's crazy, but it's crazy like a fox, as I'll point out over the next minute or two, right? And so what poses a bigger existential threat to the Jewish state? Palestinian violence? I certainly don't believe so. Again, I don't justify terrorism by any entity against any other entity, but I don't see it posing an essential threat. I think what it does is Israel's intransigence on the Palestinian issue, right? Because what the Israelis are facing, I'll give Thomas Friedman the kudos for this. I'm basically citing Thomas Friedman on this, but the Israelis have to choose. Because if you're going to have a one-state solution, and you want to be a Jewish state, that means disenfranchising Palestinians. Because every demographer who studied this says, if you just incorporate the West Bank and Gaza, that within 20, 30 years, the Palestinians are going to be the majority inside Israel. So you can either disenfranchise the Palestinians and therefore you get to maintain, you retain your Jewish state identity, or you embrace democracy under which the Palestinians will be a majority and the Jewish state disintegrates and disappears. Because the Palestinians politically would then have the ability to, win control of the national government. So I think, again, I think this is the decision the Israelis are facing. But the last thing I'll say is, I don't see any evidence whatsoever that there's any serious movement inside the Israeli government towards reconsidering, pushing towards a two-state solution. There are military commanders who are saying, please, for the love of God, let's move in that direction. But the politicians in Israel seem to be, most of them at least seem to be sort of, either consciously or simply saying, well, we've got no other choice at this point, sort of not consciously, but purposely over a long period of time, or, short term, coming to grips with the fact that this is, kind of the only game in town. So, okay, all right, well, that's my presentation. And thank you. And I'm happy to answer questions.
Share so we can see on Zoom. Put that red stop share button.
Oh, sure.
And then in the chat, Tayun has already asked a question. If you want to put on the
Yeah.
chat, and it should be the last two comments. There you go.
Okay, how did the second set of voices become dominant? Well, I think they became dominant, and it was a temporary phenomenon. I'm not saying that it was permanent, but I think this happened within the context of what happened during the 1982 war. And I guess I didn't make this point clearly enough. And it was precisely because the PLO had been ejected from Lebanon. It was significantly weakened that I think a lot of Israelis no longer saw the PLO, at least in the immediate term, as an existential threat. And in fact, the Israeli government told them that. Right, when the PLO got on all those boats in the harbor in Beirut and sailed off, the Israeli government celebrated and said, well, here, Israeli people, we told you we would do this. We've essentially weakened the PLO to the point that they're inconsequential anymore. So because there was no longer an existential threat, then you have the massacre. That's what permitted the sort of second set of voices, I think, to emerge, because there was no longer that sort of deeply held fear that the Palestinians were posing an immediate term existential threat. That has sort of fallen by the wayside. Yeah.
So the question of the failure to securitize, to what extent did it matter that it was the phalangist militias carrying out the violence and not the Israeli soldiers? So I'm just wondering, like, if this is a principal agent problem, right?
Well, that's true. Yeah.
To the militias, they've gone way too far, so we can protest the actions while still remaining true to the idea that, like, Israel is better than this, and our own military is better than this, and we just enlisted the wrong proxies to carry out this mission. So I guess I don't know a ton about the empirical case, but like, to what extent did that matter in the discussions about the use of these proxies?
Well, I first of all, we can only make sort of a supposition on that, right? Because it was the phalangists who carried it out, not the Israeli army. But I mean, I wouldn't disagree with you, and I think it's a great point that if it had been IDF forces who themselves had directly carried out the massacres, it possibly would have not eliminated, but maybe reduced that sort of, backlash and the emergence of the second set of voices there. So, but it's not, because there had never been, other than Deir Yassin, which happened before Israel was even created, which was a large-scale massacre in a Palestinian village that was carried out directly by Jewish forces prior to the creation of Israel, right? But that was before Israel was a state. So it's an interesting question. I can't say for sure, but I wouldn't disagree that it certainly at the very least raises the possibility that maybe the level of revulsion, that seemed to erupt inside of Israel would not have been as substantial if Israeli forces had been behind it. And in fact, that's what Begin tried to argue at first. We didn't do this. And anybody who in any way tries to link this to us is engaged in blood libel, was the term that he used. And he said, this is just one more example of Goyim killing Goyim, and then they come and want to blame the Jews for it. He said that as well. But I mean, I think it's a relevant point, certainly. And it's entirely possible that the response wouldn't have been quite at the same level, I guess is how I would put it. Yeah.
Oh, I was struck by, so my familiarity with this comes indirectly by way of a rather infamous interview that the philosopher Emmanuel Levinas did with Alain Finkielkraut on Israeli radio weeks after the massacre. And part of why it's infamous is because some positions are misattributed to Levinas in that interview that to this day people still associate with Levinas even though he didn't say it. But in fact, his one of the things his comments in that interview reveal is that there was also a political theological debate that was happening that people were participating in, specifically targeted at the idea of the sacredness of the land of Israel as a kind of political justification and how that relates to these kinds of moral atrocities. So if you'll indulge me, there's this really great quote where he says, not enough has been said about what the shock that the human possibility of events at Sabra and Shatila, whoever is behind them, this was unknown at the time, it was right after, whoever is behind them signifies for our entire history as Jews and as human beings. And then he goes on to quote from Talmud, and then he concludes by saying, interpreting this Talmudic passage, a person is more holy than a land, even a holy land. Since faced with an affront made to a person, this holy land appears in its nakedness to be but stone and wood. And so there was also, I just indicate, this very serious theological wrestling with how is it that our religion conceives of this land as being of special providence. So that's also kind of maybe might explain some of these questions where it's not merely the question of being convinced of a certain moral atrocity, but there's a reframing of the theology of what justifies the presence in the land of Israel to Jews.
So if I understand the quote correctly, then if we read between the lines, or maybe we're gonna have to read between the lines, the suggestion there is that, yes, there is still, it's outrage, regardless of whether it was Christian militia or Israeli soldiers.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes, sir.
This one's maybe a little bit more macro in thinking about, I know you thought deeply about securitization literature for a long time. I haven't, but I'm maybe this is just like too simple, but I'm still stuck on this idea of existential threat and how it's defined, right? Like, I'm curious how it's defined in the securitization literature, especially given the first point that you had on the future research questions of like, is an existential threat one sees to one's identity or one's like national sort of thing, like not just borders of a country, the idea of the existential threat of an army posing to another state being taken over.
Right.
You know, we talk about the existential threat of climate change, right? Is there any framing in securitization theory or thought about this? And forgive me that I was listening to a thing about sovereignty and like Schmidt last night, so this is just kind of fun, but I'm really curious as to like this idea of the existential threat to identity identity, like conceived in some of these really dangerous ways for continuing to see,
Yeah.
and like how securitization theory, if that's something there that's being talked about in some of these newer generations, because it also makes me wonder, like, if one sees an existential threat as a threat to like my identity of what the Israeli state means.
Yeah, well, I mean, one thing is that might be helpful as a response is that in the kind of seminal text by Waver et al., Security, a New Framework for Analysis, they do identify different sort of categories of threats, among them environmental. So it certainly is not, and they address societal as well. And their definition of societal security and existential threats to societal security focuses on identity. And then they treat the state as sort of a separate, though related, entity. And obviously military threats are incorporated into that. Yeah. So.
Yeah, I think it's really interesting and a really important space for.
Yeah, I did, by the way, the conference paper a few years ago where I tried to like take Schmidt and apply him to Trump. And yeah. Yeah, right. Yeah. Yeah, us versus them, and yeah, these shadowy entities that pose an existential threat to my, to Trump's definition of the American nation and American national identity and that type of thing.
That's why I was kind of curious as to like if that went anywhere in securitization theory, because the debate I was listening to yesterday, if I was a little off topic, was about why Schmidt hasn't been applied to COVID pandemic politics or policies, right? Like that would be kind of.
That seems pretty obvious, yeah.
Exactly, you can kind of see ideological reasons. for some
Right.
topics, so
Right.
it's not, but-
Well, how about
Great.
closing thoughts on what you might take away from either presentation? A lot to chew on.
This is a really basic comment on securitization and the ways in which the theory itself or the theorizing about it might sort of enable a really simplistic view of the human experience, certainly of war. Where here you have an example of the behavior of an ally, so there's an alignment of interest there. And Trump clearly chose to sort of go with it, right? But it did ultimately undermine, I think, the argument certainly that this was it certainly wasn't in the long-term interest of Israel to be massacring civilians en masse or to tolerate the behavior of allies doing so, which I think is just a foretaste actually of what they're dealing with now, and certainly their allegiance to the Trump administration, sort of going down that path.
Right.
Well, really authoritarianism, where others have argued, and I think this is much more persuasive that the long-term stability and viability of Israel very much lies in liberal democracy, and that is much more in its long-term security interests than it is even for us, although it's clearly for us too, but they are much more threatened by authoritarianism than we are. We'd love to talk more.
I'd love to. Yeah. Yeah, thanks.
We're looking for new paradigm for the cookies because we were forced to order mass amounts of